Hello, Chelsea.
Hello, everybody. Very happy to be joining you.
Great. Good to meet you.
Hi, Chelsea. Nice to meet you.
Dear all, I'm Gloria Gaggioli. I'm the director of the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to this online conference in order to launch the new joint initiative on the digitalization of armed conflict. It is a joint initiative because it will be conducted jointly by our IHL chair, Professor Robin Geis, and also by the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is represented today by Laurent Giselle. This project is a very important one for the Academy, as it opens up a new cluster of research on which the Academy wants to gather expertise and position itself, i.e. digitalization and new technologies. The objective today, and with the joint initiative, is to discuss the digitalization of armed conflicts, its humanitarian impact, and the legal protections afforded by international humanitarian law. As we all know, advancements in technologies have always had a profound impact on how wars are fought. Think about the emergence of submarines and their impact on the First World War, or the creation and military use of airplanes and their impact on the First and Second World Wars. It is thus obvious that digital technologies will revolutionize the ways wars are fought. And this is because digitalization of armed conflict is a dynamic process that involves a range of rapidly evolving technological developments, most notably in the area of cyber and other digital technologies such as artificial intelligence, machine learning, sensor systems, and robotics. Each of these developments individually, but also in combination, have an undeniable military value. However, at the same time, they entail new risks for conflict-affected populations and new protection needs. As a result, we may wonder whether IHL still provide adequate humanitarian protection in contemporary and future warfare. The project and our panelists today will address three overarching questions. The first one is, what are the risks and potential humanitarian consequences for populations affected by armed conflicts because of the digitalization of the battlefield? The second is, does international law, and in particular international humanitarian law, adequately address these risks and protection needs? The third is, if not, if IHL does not address all these protection needs, what recommendations would we develop in terms of law and policy beyond the existing IHL framework to mitigate these risks and address these protection needs? So to address these questions, the project and discussions today will adopt a multidisciplinary perspective. Thus, we will not only take into account the legal and humanitarian issues in relation to the digitalization of armed conflicts, but we will also address broader and interrelated technical, military, ethical, and policy issues. We have with us a beautiful and diverse group of experts, which reflects also the fact that the joint initiative is a multi-stakeholder initiative that will be developed in close consultation with states, IOs, NGOs, and the private sector. Our first two speakers, Robin Geis and Laurent Giselle, will address IHL-related issues with a focus on cyber and artificial intelligence. So I repeat that Robin Geis is our Swiss IHL chair at the Geneva Academy and also a professor of international law and security at the University of Glasgow. Mr. Laurent Giselle is the head of the Arms and Conduct of Hostilities unit at the Legal Division of the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva. After these two presentations on IHL-related aspects, we will broaden up the debate, and we will have Chelsea Slack, who will share her experience as deputy head of the Cyber Defense section in the Emerging Security Challenges Division of NATO. She is working at the headquarters in Brussels. And last but not least, we will have Kirstine Vignard, who is the head of Unity Support Team to the General Assembly processes pursuant to Resolution 7327 and 73-266 of the General Assembly. So now I will ask each panelist to speak for about 12 to 15 minutes maximum. So I will be the timekeeper, and I already thank you of your understanding if I need to cut you after 15 minutes so that we have sufficient time for the discussion. So after the presentations, I will give you the opportunity to interact with one another, to ask one another clarification questions, and then we will open up the debates and we will gather questions from the audience. So the audience, you know that you can participate and ask questions through the Zoom chat function. So I will collect those questions and we will try to answer most of them. So first, let's start with Robin. So Robin, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gloria. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Gloria, once again, thanks very much for your kind introduction and for hosting this initiative. It's a real pleasure to be back in Geneva, albeit only virtually for the time being. And warm thanks are also due to Laurent Giselle and the ICRC to have partnered with us in this initiative, which really is at the intersection of scholarly inquiry and practical humanitarian protection. And I think with this setup, we're very well placed to look into the protection challenges that we want to consider in this initiative. Let me perhaps start by saying a few words about what motivated this initiative. We've been working in this field of new technologies for many years. And obviously there were many considerations that started this, but I think the principal observation is that even though cyber war, digitalization of conflict have become buzzwords, I don't think the relevance that these technologies will have in future armed conflict is fully appreciated. Because the vast majority of discussions that we're currently seeing, the way that states are positioning themselves, most of this concerns peacetime operations. Malicious and harmful peacetime operations, no doubt. They're sometimes referred to as hybrid warfare or cool war. But I think when we turn to armed conflict and the regulative ambit of IHL, we should be looking at a different level of cyber operations and also uses of artificial intelligence. Just think about it. We have major military actors who consider cyberspace a new domain of warfare, who consider artificial intelligence the leading technology that one needs to master to rule the world, to cite Vladimir Putin on this. I think that is not fully appreciated in these discussions, what that might mean for future armed conflicts in terms of new risks and humanitarian protection needs that could arise. Both the United States and China have publicly stated that they intend to dominate cyberspace on a global level in times of armed conflict. It's one of their strategic priorities. Stuxnet 10 years ago, recall what a sophisticated operation that was, and just imagine what might be possible for highly potent military actors today. And also consider the merging of cyber and AI and what that might mean in terms of scale and magnitude of various digital and cyber operations taking place in times of armed conflict. So I think the magnitude and scale of what might come in the future, it's still quite hypothetical for the time being. But if I look at the increase of defense spending, the way budgets have increased, military budgets have been increased in these fields, I certainly think that this is an area of concern. And this is part of what motivated this new initiative, where we really want to consider what digital warfare in the future might look like and what new and different risks, humanitarian risks and protection needs might arise. Another observation that motivated this process is that we wanted to do things a little bit differently from the way they're currently being done. Now, we were, of course, keenly aware that there is no shortage of commissions and expert processes and inquiries into cyber norms and cyber risks, and the same is true for AI. But we also felt, and I think it's well known, that at the policy level, where the stakes are understandably very high, progress in terms of substance has been quite slow. Agreement beyond the obvious is pretty rare. We're still grappling with very basic insights so that, international law applies in cyberspace, and we haven't really made too much progress beyond that on a universal and global level. That's one observation, and that's the policy level where, as I've said before, understandably, the stakes are very high with these promising new technologies. When we turn to the legal discussion, it's quite the opposite. There, the legal discussion has been supercharged, if you want, by the Italian manuals, where very early on in the debate, we kind of superimposed most of international law onto the cyber realm. I think for very good reasons. That certainly helped create stability and calm things down at a moment where various actors seem to consider cyberspace as the Wild West. So all that is good and well, but this superimposition of international law has led us into highly technical, very sophisticated, second decimal, if you want, legal discussions. And in some regards, I sometimes feel that we have not really answered or even ask some of the very basic questions that should precede legal analysis. So I'll just give you two quick examples. And for those of you working in IHL, you'll be familiar with this. There's a long-standing, sophisticated discussion about whether data is an object in the sense of IHL. But I don't think we're really concerned with whether data is an object. I think the bigger question that's lurking in the back is what data protection should be in times of war in the 21st century. And I think that's a fairly big question and an increasingly important and relevant one. And it is not one that we should just be addressing through the very narrow prism of the wording of certain long-standing IHL regulations. The same is true for the attack debate. And again, those of you working in the field, you'll be well familiar with a very sophisticated debate about the notion of attack under the laws of armed conflict. Now, again, we're not really concerned, I think, with what that notion exactly entails. There's a much bigger question. It's about what kind of cyber operations can be executed affecting the civilian population, and at which level do the constraints of humanitarian law kick in to mitigate the consequences. It's at the heart of the matter what cyber warfare in the future might mean and how we can protect civilian populations. So in this sense, I think our initiative also aims to take a step back from all these kind of hyper-dynamic debates and technological developments, take a step back and just reconsider what exactly the protection needs and humanitarian risks are, and on that basis, start the legal discussion and check and assess whether the law as it currently stands provides adequate protection in the 21st century. And that, I think, is the bigger question that permeates all of what we're doing. We're trying to reassess what humanitarian protection is supposed to be, what adequate protection levels should be in digital warfare of the 21st century. To do this, we've designed a very dynamic, in a way open-ended, multi-stakeholder initiative. We're very honored and delighted that representatives from Nato and UNIDIR are with us today to share their perspectives. That's exactly what we want to do with this initiative, to have an interdisciplinary discussion, certainly not just a legal discussion about these issues. And we're starting this initiative without any foregone conclusions. We want to focus on problems, yes, and the fields of inquiry that we've chosen are fields that concern new and slightly different protection needs, and where the law might need more specification, clarification, possibly even development. Now, having said that, I don't know what the time is, Gloria.
Yeah, you have 3 more minutes.
Okay, I'll go quick then. So just for the avoidance of any doubt, our initiative is clearly premised on the insight and conviction that IHL applies, of course, to cyberspace. And as it currently stands, it already holds many very useful and important humanitarian protections. But as a lawyer, we're interested in the problems. And let me just, in concluding, lay out some of these problems to you, fields of inquiry that we want to look at. And maybe, Gloria, if I can get an additional 3.5 minutes for my speech, then I'll manage to get the message across.
Sure.
One field of inquiry that we want to look is the protection of societies. And I'm deliberately using these terms to show that maybe there's certain different protection needs that potentially are not fully or adequately grasped by IHL as it currently stands, and that maybe we need some additional clarification there. What I mean by this is the diffuse and intangible consequences that many cyber operations can have across societies, across important societal processes, the economy, the financial sector, and infrastructure. Now, international humanitarian law, as you know, was very much premised on kinetic warfare, the experiences from the Second World War. It was designed to prevent the worst consequences of war, not to regulate warfare per se, but to prevent the worst. So baseline protection. And this baseline protection meant that we were looking at very drastic consequences, avoiding death, injury, physical destruction. And now the consequences, cyber operations can have exactly these consequences, but they can also have a range of different, less tangible consequences. And this is the kind of consequences that we want to look at, and when they affect societies and how they can be factored into either IHL as it currently stands. And I think that's possible, and I'll give you an example in a moment. But maybe, given that these consequences can be equally drastic because they affect societies at large, they could cut off the banking sector in all of Switzerland, and that could have significant carry-on effects. We're wondering whether these types of protection needs are not protection needs that need to be factored into IHL in the 21st century more clearly. Now, just to give you one example, traditionally, if my 20-year-old car had been destroyed in the course of an armed conflict, it would clearly have been legally relevant for various IHL assessments. It's physical damage, so that means it counts for IHL as it currently stands. But if you cut off or disrupt the banking sector, certain sectors of the economy, or infrastructure, the shipping industry across a nation, it's at least less clear that these less tangible consequences will count. We can make this happen, but only if we agree on certain slightly expansive interpretations, and we need a certain degree of benevolence in approaching these issues if we want to broaden the protective ambit of IHL. Now, I don't see much benevolence in the world today, and certainly not in times of armed conflict, and this is why I personally think we would do better to clarify these issues more specifically, to make clearer that also these diffuse and less easy to grasp consequences on the society at large, at a certain threshold of severity, will need to be factored into our IHL assessments. And there's various ways, and again, as I said, we have no foregone conclusions. This is an issue that in the first instance we want to discuss and assess more closely, in dialogue also with technical experts. If I think ahead very progressively, not as a policy suggestion, just as an academic idea, we could potentially think of a new rule in analogy to the rule we already have, which looks at objects that are indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. We already have that rule. Why not contemplate a rule that protects functionalities, services that are indispensable to the functioning of a modern society or any society? That's not for the coming 12 months or so, but maybe with a long view and just recognizing what the typical effects of cyber operations can be. This might be a line of inquiry that we should pursue.
Wonderful.
If I can get that last minute, I'll just say very quickly, Gloria, and I'm sorry by starting off this panel with overstepping my time, but let me just say that the other prong in our initiative, that was the cyber prong. The other prong is artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence as a standalone technology, but also in combination with cyber applications. So I think information warfare and the way we protect the global information space or domestic media and information spaces, that is something that we'll need to consider as part of this initiative, and also with a view to armed conflict. We're constantly having these debates about fake news, hate speech, now in the run-up of US elections, electoral interference, but these are peacetime discussions. No one has really looked in the protection of the media and global information space in times of war. And I think we would all do well and be well advised to look into potential legal constraints. And this will be a very difficult field of inquiry. Ruses of war, misinformation operations are perfectly legal under the law as it currently stands. I just wonder whether this might not need some fine-tuning, considering what is possible in terms of media manipulation, misinformation in the 21st century. And then as my very last point, and really in concluding, and I promise, Gloria, uses of artificial intelligence, not as part of weapon systems. I think we've had that discussion, but the discussion that is only starting and where we want to look at more closely is uses of artificial intelligence in military decision-making more broadly. And I'll keep it short now, but I'd be happy to further discuss as part of our discussion later on. Artificial intelligence is increasingly going to be used for different kinds of military decision-making, targeting decisions, decisions about whom to detain, crowd and population control, different types of military operations, strategic planning, predictive planning, and so on. It'll certainly have benefits on many levels. It can lead to greater precision. Having more information and being able to analyze more data sets and information is certainly not a bad thing in the first instance. It can lead to greater precision in military operations, to more fine-tuning, real-time adaptations of military operations if something changes. Predictions, better predictions about the consequences of certain weapons or the second and third tier effects of military operations. So there are certainly benefits in the use of artificial intelligence, also in military affairs, but there's also very significant risks. There's the issue of retaining human control, and that's an issue not just for weapon systems, it's an issue more broadly whenever artificial intelligence-based augmented decisions affect important human values, life, bodily integrity, liberty. Will need to retain a degree of human control that allows humans to take context-specific decisions. And then we already know from civil applications of artificial intelligence that there simply is a range of still unresolved issues. There's often a certain degree of unpredictability. There's intransparency and the so-called black box problem, because it's hard to really know how exactly artificial intelligence makes and arrives at certain decisions. There can be bias, there can be poor quality input data that leads to wrong decisions, and there can be discrimination and a lack of accountability. And as these issues start to become clearer in the civilian sector, I think we'd do well to start contemplating what all of this might mean in the field of military operations, and especially with regard to operations in the context of armed conflict. So as you can see, we have quite a bit of work ahead of us, many ideas, which we look forward to discuss with all of you. And I thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Robin. So now, Laurent, Giselle, Laurent, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Gloria. Thank you and good morning, everyone. I'm very glad to be here on this panel, but more importantly, I'm extremely glad to launch this morning this initiative in partnership with the Geneva Academy and in particular in partnership with his Swiss chair of international humanitarian law, Robin Geis, an esteemed colleague and a good friend. So it's really a pleasure to be here this morning. Thank you, everyone, and thank you also to the other panelists who have joined us this morning. Gloria and Robin, you already mentioned quite broadly what the digitalization of armed conflicts might entail. I'm not going to go in much detail on that, but just to flag what is important from our perspective is to have a multidisciplinary approach, looking at all those developments individually, but also in conjunction. That's very important. Robin mentioned several of them on cyber and artificial intelligence, and that's the one we are focusing initially at least, but the digitalization of armed conflict is a broad term and a broad phenomenon that will have profound changes on armed conflicts. It's about cyber tools being used, about algorithms, artificial intelligence, but also robotics, sensor systems, any use of computer programs, computer networks, as in armed conflict, and when they are used as means and methods of warfare. So that's changes which are occurring, I think, extremely rapidly, and as I mentioned, will have profound impact in the way conflicts are waged, and that's why we are very happy to launch this initiative with the Geneva Academy and combine our expertise and resources to look at those developments. As Gloria and Robin mentioned, we have 3 objectives. I'm not going to come back on that in detail, but on the potential risk and protection needs, on assessing what the protection of the law today, and if we find that the law is not adequate or sufficient, what recommendations can be made. And on doing all that, we will, of course, not start from scratch. There have been work by many people in that domain, whether at the Geneva Academy or by Robin himself at UNIDIR. And Kirsten, I'm sure you can talk about that in detail, but also, of course, what we have done at the ICRC. And I will say a few words on that as well. It's indeed a part of our mandate at the ICRC to look at the development of new technologies, and that could be used as means and method of warfare, and what risk they can raise, and the challenge they can pose to international humanitarian law, and what risk they pose for civilians. We look at that from a multidisciplinary perspective, humanitarian, of course, but also technical, military, ethical, legal, or policy. And we regularly, of course, publish on this domain. So in my short words this morning, I will focus on the 2 strands that we have mentioning before, AI, just a few words, and cyber operations as well. On artificial intelligence, let me echo a number of the points that Robin made. We think that potential application of artificial intelligence are incredibly broad and likely to be not yet fully seen or understood, and that's why it's important that we have a more in-depth look at that, and that the work we'll do in this respect in the initiative is very important. But we see certainly at least 3 somewhat overlapping potential application of artificial intelligence and machine learning that are particularly relevant from a humanitarian perspective and for the protection of civilians. The first one is enabling increasingly autonomous systems, including autonomous weapons system. The second one is the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning for some aspects of cyber and information warfare. And the third one, which is the one Robin mentioned, is the changing nature of decision-making in warfare. And while it has been suggested that the use of artificial intelligence could offer potential for better decision-making in armed conflict to ensure actually increased compliance with IHL, there are also limits in the way this technology works, and that brings with it potential risk. And from our perspective, that raises at least two main questions, which are how to preserve the necessary decision-making in armed conflict in order to apply IHL rules and take into account the protection of civilians when fighting in conflict. So that's the first main question with regards to a number of current new digital technology, but certainly with regards to artificial intelligence in particular. And the other implication of artificial intelligence support in decision-making is the potentially increased speed of decision-making in warfare, and what does it mean for the change in warfare itself. Now, if I turn more specifically with regard to cyber operations during armed conflict, Robin mentioned that there are many cyber operations, hostile or malicious cyber operations in peacetime, and that's certainly true, and we see that every day. However, the use of cyber operations in armed conflict has also become a reality today and is likely to increase in the future in view of the extent to which states and the number of states that are developing a cyber capability. When I say it's a reality, there are, of course, states that have acknowledged publicly that they have conducted cyber operations in ongoing armed conflicts, and that's in particular the case of the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia, that have disclosed the use of cyber operations in their conflict against the Islamic State group. So that's practice that has occurred. There are also other public reports suggesting that Israel and Hamas used cyber operations once against the others. Cyber operations have affected other countries involved in armed conflict, such as Georgia in 2008, Ukraine, and Saudi Arabia more recently, though the authors of those cyber attacks remain unknown and attribution of responsibility is contested. So it's not clear whether these operations had an access to the conflict. There are a number of reports of cyber operations also by states in other situations where the legal classification may not be straightforward, including in what is sometimes referred to as the gray zone. Now, what are cyber operations potentially being used for? And of course, I will be very happy to listen also to what Gilles will say later. But of course, it includes espionage, it includes target identifications, it includes information operations that can be for various purposes. It includes the interruption, deception, or obfuscation of enemy communication systems. It might be cyber operations in support of kinetic operations, or it may be cyber operations used alone to directly cause effects. And we have seen, not necessarily in the context of armed conflict, but we have seen cyber operations against electricity systems, against healthcare systems, and even affecting nuclear facility and other critical infrastructure, which of course cause great concerns in terms of their potential human harm. The question of cyber operations and their regulation is very politicized at multilateral level and polarized, at multilateral level, including in the two working group mandated by the first committee of the General Assembly, the Open Working Group, and the group of governmental experts. From our perspective, of course, that will surprise nobody who knows the ICRC. From our perspective, of course, international humanitarian law applies to the use of cyber operations during armed conflict. What does it mean, or what does it not mean? It, of course, does not legitimize neither armed conflict nor the use of cyber operations in and of themselves. It does not encourage the militarization of cyberspace. It does not prevent the potential development of the law further. The only thing that the application of IHL does is that it restricts what is allowed today under a restricting law. It restricts that in two manners. It prohibits already the use of some cyber tools. It prohibits cyber tools that would be inherently indiscriminate weapons. And those are, in our view, already fully prohibited under current law, and it put limits on the use of tools that would not be otherwise fully prohibited, and I will come back to that in a minute. So in that regard, we are very glad to see an increasing number of states affirming that international humanitarian law limits cyber operations during armed conflict, states and international organizations, and that's the case of NATO. I'm sure we'll hear more about that later on. Now, cyber operations raise important risks from our perspective, and we have worked on that as well already since a couple of years. Those risks are linked to the interconnectedness of cyberspace. Everything that we do, I mean, the more interconnected we are, that increase what some might call the attack surface. I mean, the possibility to carry out attacks against specific targets in cyberspace from everywhere in the world to everywhere in the world with regards to connected objects. And that's, of course, vulnerability that increase the risk. Another aspect is the anonymity that characterizes cyberspace, and what anonymity means also in terms of compliance with the law, international law in general, or international humanitarian law, because of course attribution and the risk of the possibility for others to attribute some operations is normally seen as a factor to increase compliance. So anonymity might be a risk in that regard. Speed, I mentioned already before, a risk of escalation because of difficulties to know what the attacker might be willing to do, a risk of self-replication of cyber tools, risk links to re-engineering. So there are many such risks that are specific to cyber operations. When looking at risk, it's important to know what can be achieved from cyber operations. And that's something we have looked at, focusing on risk that Robin highlighted before, also risk for human beings, risk for essential services, looking in particular to essential services provided to civilians, such as medical services or other ones. And the risk that cyber operation cause for medical services is of particular concerns to us since quite some time because of the vulnerability of the medical systems to cyber operations, because they are increasingly connected themselves for a certain very good reason from a medical perspective, but that increase their vulnerability. And we have made various proposals at the Open Working Group earlier this year, but also publicly calling on states to affirm that cyber operations against the medical domains and medical infrastructure are prohibited, and to work together to prevent such operations. Now, it's important to keep those risk assessments up to date, because that's a domain that is evolving very quickly. It's important to make sure that we look at all of the risk, and indeed some of the risk that Robin mentioned earlier, we have not yet looked at them or not looked at them in depth, and that's certainly one of our purpose in doing this joint initiative, to broaden the assessment, have this assessment being made updated, and ensure that the analysis is to the point with regard to the potential use of those means in armed conflict, and to what extent those used in armed conflict might be different from used in peacetime. Now, on the question of the adequacy of the law and whether the law, how does the law address those risks, and whether the law is sufficient or not. That's something that is at the heart of everything we do, of course, in terms of our assessment of new means and method of warfare. And I think here it's there have been a number of legal debates that Robin mentioned that are sometimes seen as very technically legal debates, but I think it's important, and that's also one of the purpose through this initiative and or discussion around it, to kind of take those debates out of the purely legal realm and say, what do they mean for in reality? and not just as being seen as a legal debate on whether data are an object, but what does it mean in reality, this legal debate? What does the legal debate on attack that Robin mentioned, what does it mean in terms of protection of civilians? And I will just take the example that Robin mentioned of attacking through a cyber operations, the banking infrastructure in Switzerland, but that can be for any other domain. That's also valid for electricity or others. The debate on attack is precisely to look how to apply the principle of distinction in cyberspace or for cyber operations, in the sense that, the principle of distinction is that some objects are protecting against attacks and others are not protecting against attack. And there are more specific rules on the prohibition of cyber attacks. So let's take civilian objects like a banking infrastructure in Switzerland, or like an electricity network that would not be a military objective. What type of operations are already prohibited or not prohibited under current law? And is it possible or not under existing law to lawfully turn off the electricity even when it's not a military objective, or to turn off the banking system even when it's not a military objective? That's the center of the debate on attack, and so it has profound impact on the protection that the law today offers to civilians against the effects of cyber operations. So in that sense, the question of how states...
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you think about wrapping up?
Thank you. I will. The question of how states interpret and will interpret IHL rules with regard to cyber operations is absolutely key and critical to assess the protection that the civilians will be afforded from cyber operations. And that's why also we have always pushed for states to discuss how, and to move the discussion on how IHL applies to cyber operations and how it already restricts and limits cyber operations and therefore afford protection against the effects of cyber operations. So through this initiative, we hope to feed that debate to broaden, and not only on cyber, but more generally on the digitalization of armed conflict, to have a clearer and better assessment of the risk in order to have a more informed debate at international level as well on the way forward in terms of how to understand and interpret current existing law with regards to operations, and based on both the risk, what the law entails, what the law already affords in terms of protection, whether there is a need to make more recommendations in terms of legal or policy development in that regard. I'm very much looking forward to continue discussing that and of course to work on that with Robin and the Geneva Academy in years to come through this initiative. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Laurent, for this very dense and fascinating presentation. I give now the floor to Chelsea Slack from Nato.
Well, good morning, everybody from Brussels. Thank you very much, Gloria. It's a real pleasure to be joining you via cyberspace for a discussion on the digitalization of armed conflict. So thank you very much to the Academy as well as to the ICRC. Really a pleasure to be here with you. As part of this multidisciplinary discussion today, the organizers asked that I share with you some of the developments in NATO cyber defense over the last 2 decades, how our policy-making process in the area of cyber defense has unfolded, and what are some of the key policy challenges that we're currently grappling with, also in the context of the broader discussions underway. So I will indeed focus my remarks over the next few minutes on the high-level policy aspects of the area that I work in, rather than the legal aspects. But of course, I'm glad to be joined by Robin and Laurent in that sense. So I'm going to begin with one of my favorite quotes about cyberspace, and it comes from an article in The Economist from a few years back, and in a rather Monty Python-esque fashion, it reads as follows. So, apart from email, Skype, Facebook, iPads, iPods, drains, water, electricity, and air traffic control, what has cyberspace ever done for us? And I really like that quote because I think it encapsulates the breadth of the connectivity that we have in this space, the reliance on it, and as we're discussing the increasing digitalization of all aspects of our lives, particularly in the area of international peace and security, the way that we rely on it, the need to harness the benefits and manage the risks. I think this quote encapsulates that quite nicely. And that is, of course, what NATO and its 30 allies are seeking to do, in a sense of protecting themselves in cyberspace. In that sense, cyber defense has really been a top priority for us over the last few years. So before diving into the cyber aspects, I'd like to recall a few principles more generally about NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a political military alliance. It's comprised of 30 allies now who have promised to defend one another in the spirit of collective defense, who also work as part of a cooperative approach to security with other partner countries, international organizations, industry, and academia. So those are the high-level principles of the alliance, 30 countries, political military alliance, and these same principles now apply in cyberspace. So what is NATO doing in cyberspace? First and foremost, what is our mandate for cyber defense? You can think of it as having three main pillars. The first is we are fundamentally responsible for the protection of our own networks. So that's the headquarters in Brussels, missions and operations, different joint commands, the NATO infrastructure, if you like. Our fundamental responsibility in cyber defense is to protect our assets and our infrastructures. The second pillar of our activity is operating in cyberspace. And that's a newer dimension, which I'll get to in a moment with the recognition of cyberspace as a domain of operations, but increasingly to ensure that our commanders are prepared for the battlefield of the 21st century. And that is through operating in cyberspace in the context of our missions and operations. The third pillar is that we are working to help our 30 allies enhance their resilience at the national level. Fundamentally, it's allies who are responsible for the development of their capabilities, how they organize their cyber defenses, but NATO can be used as a platform where best practice is shared, research and development is undertaken, different ideas about national practice and where this issue is going, that NATO can be used as a platform for that purpose. So bottom line, three things in terms of NATO's mandate in cyber defense: protecting our assets, operating in cyberspace, and helping allies to enhance their own national resilience when it comes to cyber defense. Now, I'd like to go back in time and to the early 2000s and recall a little bit NATO's journey in this field and some of the developments that have spurred our thinking and our policymaking process. So way back in 2002 is actually what we consider to be when we first recognized and developed a capability in this area. So it was actually in 2002 where we first developed our NATO incident response capability. That's our CERT, if you like, and that's our capability that's responsible for the defense of NATO networks. So that was all the way back in 2002. And the approach that NATO took was very much from a technical perspective, network defense, protecting once again those assets and infrastructures. Well, then, of course, we saw the events in Estonia in 2007, and that spurred NATO's thinking once again into, seeing the use of cyber tools in broader political strategic context. Are we prepared in order to defend our allies, or are allies prepared to deal with some of these new challenges emanating from cyberspace? So that spurred the development of NATO's very first cyber defense policy in 2008. And we set out some of the founding principles, objectives for what NATO hoped to achieve in cyber defense. It was still very much from a technical perspective, but it did start from a political perspective to set out in more detail the objectives and the vision. Then, of course, we saw the conflict in Georgia in 2008, where cyber tools were deployed alongside more conventional capability. Once again, thinking, okay, how do we respond? How do we ensure that our missions and operations in the future and allied security can remain fit for purpose? So that very much resulted in 2010 with the NATO strategic concept. And for the very first time in that strategic concept, cyber threats were recognized as potentially reaching a threshold that could threaten the stability, security, and prosperity of the Euro-Atlantic area. So from a political perspective, that was a pretty big recognition. You go from treating it primarily as a technical issue to now it is in the strategic concept, which is NATO's founding document in terms of the mandate and mission for the years to come at that particular time. Then, of course, we saw the events in Ukraine, 2014, and the increasing, as has already been referred to as hybrid activity. And 2014 was a really seminal year in our policy development at NATO, because it was here for the first time that allies recognized cyber defense as being part of NATO's core task of collective defense. So NATO's whole reason for being the collective defense clause. And now you have the formal recognition that a cyber attack could be grounds to invoke Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. So that's about as political as it gets in terms of a policy or paradigm shift. But that notion that cyber defense is part of collective defense was balanced with the affirmation by allies that international law, including international humanitarian law, applies in cyberspace. And that was very much following the decision the previous year, the work that was undertaken in the UN from the group of governmental experts that also recognized international law as applying in cyberspace. So 2014, quite an important year when it comes to the development of NATO's policymaking process, more along the lines of the political aspects of it. 2016 was an important year because we had the recognition of cyberspace as a domain of operations, and I'm going to get to that in a moment. But of course, that was NATO continuing to adapt and continuing to ensure that our processes, are meeting the challenges and the threats that we're facing. This also led to an initiative to enhance resilience, what we call the Cyber Defense Pledge. I'll also get that to in a moment. But you see a theme emerging of NATO adapting, of NATO looking at the geopolitical landscape, of some of the threats that we're facing, and then developing the policies and the procedures around that in order to meet those new challenges. So I guess the bottom line after this retrospective of the last two decades, if you like, is really we've gone from a technical approach to a more political one. The fact also that our policy has evolved in a measured way in response to geopolitical events, and of course in recognition of the fact that international law applies. So with kind of the general scene setter about what we do, how the policy making process has evolved and our thinking has evolved, we'd just like to get into a few more details about some of our current policy initiatives and the challenges that we're working through. So under our first basket, a lot of our effort goes into developing NATO cyber defenses. So in line with our defensive mandate, we recognize cyber defense contributes to NATO's broader deterrence and defense posture, and that unfortunately cyber threats to the alliance are becoming more frequent, complex, destructive, and coercive. So we need to be responding to that. Now, as recognizing the fact that we do need to be just as effective in cyberspace as the other domains, in 2016, allies formally recognized cyberspace as a domain of operations. Now, what have we done since? What does this mean? Well, in practice, we have been undertaking an effort the last few years as part of a roadmap to look at the way doctrine is developed, what doctrines are out there, our strategies, what needs further development, how does this link up with the other more traditional domains, how do we plan, so our operational planning processes, how do we train, how do we exercise, so really looking at mainstreaming cyber considerations into the other more traditional domains, in addition to really having a look at, okay, if we need to assure a mission in cyberspace, how can we best equip ourselves in terms of the doctrine and the planning that goes behind that. So that's been a process that our colleagues on the military side have been very focused on in order to in essence ensure that our commanders are working within the parameters of the threats that we face. In addition, allies have recognized that they will, within NATO's defensive mandate, they will employ the full range of capabilities, including cyber, to deter, defend against, and to counter the full spectrum of cyber threats. And so a lot of the work we've been doing in recent years has focused on how do we deter and respond to those malicious cyber activities that might not necessarily reach the threshold of that more high-end security defense aspects, but that are still inherently destabilizing. And so we've been doing some work in terms of what's our toolbox, what do we have? What are the political measures, the diplomatic measures, the military measures, economic, legal, looking across the spectrum to see, what's our allies' toolboxes at the national level, and then how can NATO be used as a platform also to help to coordinate potential responses at the national level. So looking very much in the military space at the domain, but then also at using the full spectrum of the toolbox to see how we counter some of these malicious cyber activities that are inherently destabilizing increasing and that increasingly we face. So that's the basket of developing NATO cyber defenses. As an alliance of 30 countries, the second basket focuses on enhancing resilience. So as I mentioned at the outset, under Article 3 of the Washington Treaty, it is up to each ally to do their homework, so to speak, when it comes to developing their own national cyber defenses. But what NATO can do is to help allies have certain objectives, common objectives in different areas that then they can work towards. So our cyber defense pledge was adopted by the heads of state and government in 2016. It is a public document on our website, and allies have signed up to enhance their cyber defenses as a matter of priority. That includes also their national infrastructure, critical infrastructures. So we're not, once again, it's not NATO saying, allies, you must do this, this, and this, but what it is allies collectively coming together and saying, we would like to develop partnerships with industry, or we're going to be working on awareness programs for our populations, or how are we resourcing cyber defense? How are we doing education and training in this field? The planning dimensions of it. So really looking across the broad spectrum of the different policy issues from a whole government perspective to help allies raise the level of their cyber defenses. So that is a very important process focused on resilience, but also, of course, speaks to the heart of national capabilities as well as the protection of governments, of societies, of critical infrastructures. And that's what allies are undertaking as part of the Cyber Defense Pledge. Last but not least, of course, cooperative security, a really important principle for NATO. So as part of our cyber defense mandate, recognizing that cyberspace is a shared space and that its security is our shared responsibility, we work with more than 40 different partner countries, other international organizations, industry, academia, civil society, to develop our thinking, to share information. We have some countries take part in our exercises. We cooperate on research and development activities. So the whole spectrum, if you like, because we do recognize that while the military component is important, the political and the multi-stakeholder approach as well is something that we try to draw upon. Which leads me to conclude that a lot of what I've talked about is how NATO has been adapting to the cyber threat landscape, developing its tools, its capabilities, its processes, its partnerships in order to defend and also to respond to some of the malicious activity we're seeing in cyberspace. But we also support efforts that seek to prevent these malicious cyber activities from happening in the first place. And so allies have repeatedly affirmed international law, including IHL applies in cyberspace, and their commitment to act in accordance with it, in accordance with our defensive mandate. Allies, through their summit declarations, have expressed support for maintaining international peace and security in cyberspace, including efforts to reduce the risk of miscalculation and to promote stability. So we'll be interested to hear from Kirsten on that side, because here I'm talking about our support for the development of voluntary norms of responsible state behavior, the confidence building measures in cyberspace. So very much looking at those efforts that are happening in broader stability conversations and being aware of what's going on. And really getting behind the notion of that we seek to uphold a rules-based, open, free, and secure cyberspace. And I just draw your attention to a statement by the North Atlantic Council at the beginning of June. This was a statement from the political leaders at the Alliance condemning the malicious cyber activities that were taking place in the context of the COVID pandemic. So once again, as we talk about signaling and about conveying what's acceptable and what's not in cyberspace as a means to try to promote stability. That statement from the Council in June was a very important signal in that respect. And last but not least, of course, using NATO as a platform where allies can come and share their national practice, their national thinking, how their national, for example, legal discussions are shaping up, what are some of the key issues, and then using NATO as a platform should allies wish to discuss these issues, to figure out what more we need to look into, how we're working with civil society, academia on these important topics. So we very much welcome NATO the occasion to have these types of conversations, which is why I'll conclude just by thanking once again the organizers. Really, these multi-stakeholder discussions are really important, and of course, we welcome the occasion to engage in the coming years as part of this initiative. So thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, and thank you for keeping the time very precisely. So we are right on time now. So now I introduce Kirsten. So from Unity, Kirsten, you can take the floor.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the Geneva Academy and for the ICRC for launching this important project and for the opportunity to be part of today's event. In some ways, being the final speaker after 3 great interventions is both the hardest and the easiest slot on any panel. Many of the points that I would have liked to touch on have already been raised, so I was particularly glad, for example, that Robin brought up that this initiative will take forward topics that Unitaire certainly has had an interest in and has worked on now for several years, including AI and military decision support systems and questions of predictability and explainability. So I'm going to come at this, since this is multidisciplinary, more from an arms control approach, not a legal approach per se. And maybe just highlight a few key points or drill down on a few that have maybe already been raised or not yet been raised, and things that I think deserve perhaps a bit more attention as you begin this initiative. So while listening to the interventions, I've been reflecting on what arms control may bring to the table to help us address digital technologies. And just, you know, for those who aren't dyed-in-the-wool arms controllers, we all turn to arms control to meet a variety of objectives traditionally, that's stability. So to remove incentives for first attack, to prevent conflict, and to reduce escalation. We turn to arms control for safety reasons, to reduce risks. And often, of course, there's legal objectives of arms control to ensure compliance with international legal obligations, both under IHL, but also international human rights law. So when we look at the digitization of conflict, we could take a historical lens, perhaps drawing from the multilateral cybersecurity negotiations that have been underway in the UN system since 2004. So we're not starting from scratch here. We have quite a history, and we also, of course, have the discussions under CCW for some years now on lethal autonomous weapon systems. So I'll be drawing some of my reflections based on the work I've done for the past decade supporting the chairs of the cyber negotiations and our work at Unitaire on increasing autonomy in weapon systems since 2013. So by way of a refresher, at the UN level, we have 2 sets of discussions happening that are taking kind of different slices of the digitization question. We've had, since 2004, we've had negotiations in a first closed limited membership body called Groups of Governmental Experts that have met over 5 times until, 5 times. That looked at responsible state behavior in the use of state use of ICTs, which of course has a normative and a legal component. At the same time, in those negotiations, we haven't talked about advancements in machine learnings and how that affects our offensive and defensive cybersecurity landscape. And just to complicate things, in 2019, we started a second type of cyber negotiations encompassing all member states called the Open-Ended Working Group. So there's our ICTs and international security negotiations happening over here. They've been going on again for 15 years or so. And then we have the CCW discussions on lethal autonomous weapon systems, also confusingly called the GGE, but that's a whole different type of GGE, just with the same name. That's addressing machine learning in physical weapon systems, and not even really so much in cyber physical systems. And here we have years of discussion on things, really important legal principles on responsibility and accountability. We've had lots of discussion on human control. And there seems to be, over time, as that conversation is maturing, a bit of a division between those participants and stakeholders who see that the law's discussion mandate is quite limiting, and the desire to consider wider AI-enabled weapon systems and support systems more generally. So we see it turning into a larger, or a desire by some to turn into a larger conversation about artificial intelligence and military applications of AI. And so what we see in these 2 processes is very siloed multilateral discussions. They're both discussing norms and legality of particular uses of code, and yet we have different processes. They're attended by different experts. There's different levels of multi-stakeholder engagement and participation in each. There's different composition of delegations. And this is perhaps problematic. It can be problematic because it could lead to fragmentation of our normative and legal frameworks as we're going to come up, and as we're starting to come up with kind of different answers to some of the challenges that digital technologies raise. And I'll just give you just one example. In both negotiations, we are considering what is responsible state behavior in the use of digital technologies, and responsible in the sense of complying with international legal obligations and emerging or negotiated norms. And yet we're coming up with different, let's say, answers. In the laws conversation within CCW, human control and human oversight have been a central point of discussion throughout the discussions now for several years. And I'll be honest with you, in the cyber negotiations that I've been involved in now for over a decade, human control over cyber operations has never been raised, never. It's not a point of discussion. And so, despite, by the way, the technological feasibility of increasingly autonomous defensive and offensive cyber operations since at least 2016, DARPA's Grand Cyber Challenge, which is an international competition. This is not some secret program that we hear rumors of in some government basement. We know that there is technological, it is possible to, and desirable in some cases, to have increasingly autonomous cyber operations. What they're used for is a different issue. But to hold these two digital technology conversations and their implications for international security, to hold them separate and with no cross-fertilization in the normative and legal conversation could be increasingly problematic. So that's my first point, is we need to think about these silos and if they're serving us well as we try to create a robust system of protections, both legal and normative. Secondly, however important these discussions are, there's parts of digitization of conflict that are perhaps not being considered at the international security arms control disarmament fora. There's a range of potential digital harms and risks, either in traditional conflict environments or in situations that are outside our traditional notions or definitions of armed conflict. And these include, they've already been mentioned, some of them, where digital technologies are leveraged to interfere in internal affairs of states. This is not new, but it's of course amplified now with digital technologies in a way that I think was unforeseen before. Now this can interfere in internal affairs of states. It can spread disinformation and misinformation. It can fan extremism and internal unrest and destabilization. And it can cast uncertainty about responsibility of attacks, and that can potentially lead to misattribution and perhaps an escalation of conflict. So interference in internal affairs is not a domestic problem. It can rise to the level of something that destabilizes at the international level. There's, of course, military applications of AI outside of weapon systems, which Robin brought up at the beginning. It's something that Unitire's looked at. Earlier this year, we produced a report on modernizing arms control, exploring responses to the use of AI in military decision-making. We're continuing that work now. This is a really important issue, and it builds on some of the predictive analytics. We have a lot of data and information on, for example, predictive policing and how that the issues with that, there's no reason to think that some of the risks that have been identified there will not also be transferred into a military environment. So we need to be talking more about that. What are the risks there? Moving behind hacking systems and devices, we are entering a world in which human hacking is a thing, right? We already see manipulation of behavior through information advances, through manipulating behavior through information, disinformation, misinformation. But we have technological advances in the brain-computer interface that raises questions about manipulating thoughts and behaviors of individuals. And this sounds very science fiction. A couple of years ago when I started reading about this, I was like, yeah. But as we advance on our sensor technologies in very important beneficial applications, for example, in helping paraplegics regain mobility, being able to operate through sensors, operate mechanical arms, for example, we are also opening pathways to manipulating physical behavior of human beings. And that's something we need to think about, the amazing benefits and also the risks that could entail. So that sounds far-fetched, but again, it's forward-looking and I want to put it on the table. And that's just to name a few. So the biggest challenges before us are actually that digital technologies don't neatly fit a definition of a weapon. I mean, that's just it. Their characteristics, the fact that they're intangible, replicability, the fact that they're anonymous, and in many cases they're opaque or black box nature, those sit on top of challenges that we already struggle with, dealing with dual use technologies, dealing with an increasing number of capable actors, and of course, all of that situated in a global environment that's characterized by a growing lack of trust and increased conflict. So perhaps now to transition us to the discussion segment, I'm just going to maybe raise a few questions, 3 in particular. First, what's in and out of scope of this conversation about digitization of conflict? Perhaps it's time to reassess what we consider to be conflict. In her introductory remarks, Gloria emphasized how technology changes how wars are fought. But the other side of that coin is this question of perhaps how these technologies allow wars in the classic sense not to be fought, and we use other means. How they may permit conflict, through other means, facilitate conflict through other means. That brings us to what is a weapon? How is force and influence projected in the digital environment to coerce or to harm? And I'm by no means, and Laura, before you get worried here, I'm no means suggesting that we need to throw out IHL or but rather we might need a collective reckoning that pervasive, persistent, and extremely harmful actions in the digital environment that threaten international peace and security, that cause significant harm to non-combatants, to economies and societies, may never reach the threshold of an armed attack. And we see that already today. And by recognizing that and saying, what do we need? What more? What sort of additional protections should the international community be considering that specifically address the characteristics of digitization of armed conflict? Of international conflict. Second question is, who needs to be part of this conversation? It can't just be lawyers, but nor can it just be policymakers or policy analysts like myself. It can't be just diplomats. I mean, globally, technological literacy is appallingly low. We must, as we've done in every arms control discussion, involve more scientists and technologists. We really have no choice in that. There has been very early engagement, particularly by technologists in advocacy campaigns. Again, this is nothing new. There's a long history of this in arms control. So we've seen, for example, technologists be very involved in the campaign to ban killer robots. But we need other sorts of scientific and technical engagement as well, in addition to advocacy, not instead of, but in addition to. We need more scientists to be invited to be part of national delegations in these conversations. We need the establishment of advisory bodies, as we've had in many of our negotiations in the past. And perhaps hardest for states to accept, we have to find an appropriate role for the private sector. Its role as an innovator, a technology supplier to governments and militaries, and as a service provider, has to be involved as a partner when we look at international security and stability issues. And lastly, as a community of practice, what should be our objectives, or I should say communities of practice? All of us should be asking, what are our objectives in the short term and our desirable outcomes in the long term? In the current geopolitical environment, new legally binding instruments are, let's say, unlikely. Consensus is also extraordinarily elusive. So is the future like-minded initiatives? Is it norms? Norms are very powerful tools. But they are also slow. They're a slow process to develop norms. It's a slow process to recognize them and socialize them. Norms are a long haul game. We need to transition from identifying and negotiating norms and principles to operationalizing them and holding states accountable. So 3 short-term suggestions from where I sit for your consideration. We need to raise awareness of digital harms and the potential for digital harms and risks. And one would think that our daily headlines would be sufficient to raise awareness, but it's not, clearly. Our resources at the national and community levels are not following. So initiatives like this one of the Geneva Academy and the ICRC lend important voices to this effort. Second, we need to build capacity in national governments. And that's really challenging because a prerequisite for that isn't that we need more capacity building initiatives where well-meaning organizations parachute into national or regional environments and give capacity building workshops or have some sort of capacity building endeavor. The prerequisite for that is there has to be a place for that information to go, right? A country has to have some sort of internal structure, either a national policy or something to hang that on. So it's a good chicken and egg with capacity building. So we need to really make sure that we focus on getting governments to have the capacity to first organize internally on digital technologies. And fundamentally, and this is my last point, Gloria, is cybersecurity, cybersecurity, cybersecurity. I'm going to be a broken record on this. The securing of our devices, our systems, and our data is a responsibility of every individual, of every institution, every company, and every government. I cannot stress this enough. Digital security is a design choice. It should be a consumer demand. It is an expectation and a responsibility of our employers, of our work environments. It's a responsibility of those public institutions that we entrust to hold our digital lives and our identities. As Chelsea brought up, protecting assets and infrastructures is a priority. It should be a priority for every member state of the United Nations, not just of NATO. And we know that our critical infrastructures are vulnerable. We know we have vulnerabilities, digital vulnerabilities in our existing weapon systems. So cybersecurity is the bedrock for all of these conversations going forward. The digital environment is a vastly powerful one, and we must secure it and ourselves as if our lives depended on it, because in fact, they do.
Excellent. Thank you so much. This is really exciting to hear your comments, and thank you for raising these challenging questions. So before taking the questions from the chat, and we have many, I have to tell you, and they are quite good questions, quite detailed. Do you want, dear panelists, to raise questions, provide comments on the presentations that have been made? Robin.
Hey, Gloria, I just have a quick reaction to the excellent presentation Kirsten just made. First of all, just to echo that, I really liked how you highlighted that the human control issue has not been raised in cyber, where a lot of operations are already carried out based on algorithmic decision-making today, just to match the speed of cyberspace. And that goes largely unnoticed and is somehow below the radar. And I fully agree with you that that certainly needs more attention. But I also have a question to Kirsten, and I don't expect an answer because I don't know if anyone has it, but I was intrigued by how you mentioned the siloed mentalities in relation to AI, the vastness and inflation of processes on different levels, different actors, different agendas, clearly. And we have the very same, of course, as you know, best with cyberspace. So it seems to me that all these processes that we're seeing in relation to new technologies, they are very fragmented and very dispersed. And increasingly, I think we should be concerned how to coordinate all of this and pull it back together so that it can make sense. Because if everyone tries to clarify whether it's the law, the policy, the technology, when they try all to clarify it individually, then at the end we'll end up with cacophony and not a coherent approach, which I think defies the purpose of many of these exercises. And I think in cyberspace, we're seeing exactly that, or there is at least a risk. Increasingly, states are now coming out, European states, NATO member states, for good reasons, they're coming out with very sophisticated legal positions individually of how they think international law applies to cyberspace. And this is state practice meant to shape customary law around cyber issues. It's well-intended, clarification is clearly needed, it's pushing the agenda. I agree with a lot of this. I only fear that ever more states engage in this exercise, and then we end up with 195 different position papers, and it'll be very difficult to bring that all back together. So maybe, Kirsten, you have an idea for a panacea to where we could go or how we could better coordinate these processes in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Robin. If I had, I can assure you, if I had a real, wave my magic wand, we wouldn't be here today. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to do that. And your concern about, it's important that states internally come at the national level with their interpretation. Your concern that we could end up with, as many interpretations as there are member states of the United Nations, I think is a valid one, and it's raised by some states participating in the process. But at the same time, it is an important step for we can't. The argument goes that we can't say there's legal gaps that must be filled if we don't know what we think about it, right? You can't just say, oh, I just take it on your word that there's a gap, right? I need to, internalize and do kind of show the math of how I got to that conclusion. So there's a balance to be struck there. We certainly can't just stop when we have everyone's, national interpretation and say, there it is, a bit of a free-for-all. So the question is, what do we do once we've encouraged all these states to do their national analysis? Then what? And that's what we should be talking about and thinking about. What are we going to do once everyone has done the math, right? Because surprise, surprise, not everyone's going to come up with the same answer. So it doesn't necessarily get us out of the fact that we have fundamental divisions in our interpretation of international law, but we should be preparing for that, and I don't think we should discourage countries from doing the math. On your other issue about coordination, I'm not having witnessed these processes both on autonomous weapon systems and ICT's international security. I have to say I don't have a lot of faith in this idea that we can just smush these conversations all together, that all digital technology conversations somehow can end up around the same table. I think that would further slow us down, particularly with the environments that we have now and the histories that we have. Maybe that would have been possible before, but I think that train has left the station. There definitely needs to be more opportunities for interchange. And I think that kind of the fundamental part of that starts with technology. We have to really better understand technology. So I'm hoping that the scientific and technological community can be more of that bridge to begin with. So we know what we're talking about, what's real, what's not real, what's possible, what's coming down the pipe. How are we using technologies, and how are we using technologies in combination? Because we often talk about them like it's a single thing, and we don't talk about how they're amplified when they are networked together, when they are kind of strapped on to existing systems, et cetera, and how that changes things. So we need more cross-fertilization between these conversations. And I'm just going to say that we also need more cross-fertilization between the international security conversation about the digitization of conflict and where it overlaps with our conversations on cybercrime. So these are two very distinct conversations. They're held by different parts of the General Assembly and different specialized agencies in the UN. And yet we know that a lot of our, the use of proxies by states, that's a criminal act. At the same time, it is one that is of concern on international security when actors are working on the behalf of states. We see a lot of this in the digital environment. So we need to also have more conversation between those two silos. And again, it's not one ring to rule them all, but we need to have more interplay and more cooperation between law enforcement, for example, and the international security dimension.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Laurent or Chelsea, do you want to introduce comments based on that discussion or on something else that was discussed broader by the panelists?
Yeah, if it's, I can have just a few words on what have just been discussed, because I very much echo Kirsten in the importance of having states developing their own positions. We view that as key. I also very much hear what you say, Kirsten, in terms of looking what is afterwards once they have each done it. But I think of course, you know it better than me, they don't do it that in isolation. When they do it, they also look at what others do and are influenced by those who have taken positions before or not, or positioned themselves in that regard. So in a way, the work of comparing and bringing and developing potential area of consensus is already starting while everyone is doing its own national positions. And of course, we might, I mean, as both Robin and Kirsten said, we might end up with 193 different positions, but I think we will, and it's important to identify where there are diverging views, but issuing, I mean, states developing national position might also show area on which maybe 193 states agree on one particular aspect, while of course we will focus on those where they don't agree, because that's where we need to work further and continue working, and therefore there will be in a way more attention to that. But probably the most important part is the part where everybody agrees, and that's kind of done, and that's why we no longer speak about it, but that's absolutely key moving forward. And as Kirsten, you mentioned, identify gaps, and precisely where there is no gaps, because people do agree. I mean, we have mentioned several issues with regards to cyber operations and how they can be raised issues with regard to application of IHL challenges. But one aspect that I'm not going to say 193 states agree today, but where there might be more consensus than the definition of attack would be, for instance, that it is prohibited to directly kill somebody who is a civilian through a cyber operation during an armed conflict. That seems kind of, at least for an IHL lawyer, seems relatively obvious and raising no questions once you agree that IHL applies to cyber operations. And maybe that's not at the forefront of the discussion, because it's for all of us, at least in the legal domain, it seems to be very much obvious. And I could assume that's also the case for states who said that IHL applies, and that's the minimum. Now, looking forward in that, I was wondering if, Chelsea, you want also to react on this question of reaching a consensus view among states, and what is the role of an international organization like NATO, where you have many member states which are discussing these issues, as NATO have recognized that, have affirmed that IHL applies, and what is the role of NATO in terms of kind of fostering consensus on how IHL should be interpreted and applied in when it comes to cyber operations.
Thank you, Laurent. I'll pick up a few points here. First, so back to what I was saying about NATO as this platform. So indeed, it states that make and are party to the treaties, conventions for international law. So fundamentally, as an international organization made up of states, we do look to our member states in terms of their national interpretations, their thinking, how this is being developed. So fundamentally, it is for our allies. But of course, NATO is used as a platform where these national perspectives and interpretations, we can foster a discussion here about what is the latest thinking on this topic, also informed by some of the academic work and thinking that's going on. And here referring to also what was mentioned before a few years back with the Tallinn manuals, and trying to have a constructive debate on what are some of the questions that are left unanswered. How do we get into these details? And we might not all necessarily agree at this stage, but very much agree with Kirsten that you need to have the discussion, and it's important to clarify these positions, to then come and sit around the table together and say, okay, where is there consensus, where is there convergence, and what can we do in order to clarify further the types of questions that we need to answer, and how can we get that expertise from the different communities, so that it's not just the one community speaking to itself. So would say that it's allies that make the international law and that come up with their national positions, but we have NATO as a platform where these national discussions can of course be brought. That dovetails nicely then, and I'm also going to pick up on a question in the chat that was talking about we see perhaps different security sector, different sectors becoming involved more from law enforcement or perhaps non-traditional areas in this space. And that's very much something that, when we're looking at conflict or systems, traditionally a conventional capability, the armed forces would be the one that, procures it, maintains it, and, they can pretty much do this themselves. Whereas, as we said, with technology space, with cyberspace, you have service providers, it's the industry that's the innovator, your service provider, the operator. So then it's meant a new way of doing business, in essence, in a traditional kind of military political sense, that you are very reliant on the civilian capacity and the expertise and the innovation. So that's meant a new way of working. And as Kirsten said, also trying to bring in the science and technology community, the research and development aspects into the more traditional then thinking in the security space. And that's also something we've been trying to foster too, as part of kind of national efforts to raise awareness, and not, the traditional just ministries of defense or foreign affairs ministries, but, cyber touches ministries of education and interior and finance. So of course, once again, it's up to allies to decide how they build their capabilities, their structure, their partnerships within, but having this recognition that it is this whole government, whole society approach, given that these cyber aspects are so multifaceted. So those would be my initial points before we get to the other questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So I will now take some questions from our audience. Try to keep the answers short so that we can take as many questions as possible. I will just mention the first name of the people because they might not necessarily want the full identity to be disclosed. So I have first a question from a Yasmin, an alumna of the Academy. And the question is for Robin. So it's as follows. Robin, you mentioned that the project will cover AI in military decision-making and also its nexus with cyber. First, I was wondering to what extent will the project also cover the use of AI in conjunction with other technologies, including space-based military assets, neurotechnology, etc. And what are the implications and protections under IHL? Then the second question from Yasmin is, will you also be looking at the humanitarian implications of the increasing digitalization and dependency on cyber and AI tech for nuclear command, control and communication system, especially the implications on nuclear weapons risks? So basically, it's really about the scope of your research.
Yeah, thanks very much. An excellent question. The scope of our research is a bit open-ended and dynamic, as I said in my opening statement. So we're certainly open to attune and adapt it as this hyper-dynamic field of new technologies unfolds. But I don't think we're of the mind to focus specifically on nuclear weapons. I think that's quite an issue of its own. Though this being said, many of the aspects and risks and protection needs that we'll be looking at in relation to AI functionalities, by analogy, they will also have an effect if these technologies are applied to nuclear weapons. And God forbid. That said, with regard to other new technologies, no, I think initially we have quite a bit on our plate, as the excellent discussion here today shows. So I don't think we're planning to venture into additional new technology developments, except perhaps for advancements in robotics and sensor systems. I'd really like to stress the issue of sensor systems, reconnaissance capabilities, intelligence collection capabilities regarding facial recognition, behavioral pattern recognition, and all of this, because all of this is AI driven, and B, will help to leverage the power that AI can unfold. The hunger for data in future conflicts is only going to grow. The more data and the more accurate data an adversary can collect, the better it'll be able to apply AI functionalities to analyze all of this data. Well, you said no, I'll leave it there. You wanted us to keep answers short, so I'll leave it there.
Sure. Thank you very much. I have another question, which is more a definitional issue from Bram, who says the following: with regard to human-machine teaming in targeting processes and increasingly autonomous weapon system, how should we define autonomy and meaningful human control. So how would you clarify those terms in the context of human-machine teaming?
Do you want me to take this one?
Yeah.
I don't know to whom it was addressed, if it was for somebody, but I'm happy to at least provide some perspective from our side. Those notions are very much debated, notably in the GG on lethal autonomous weapons that Kirsten mentioned. So Kirsten, you might also want to talk about that. So they are debated, and we'll need to see how we discuss that in the initiative. What I can say is that at the ICRC, we have provided or proposed definition of what we understand by an autonomous weapon system. That means a system that selects and engage a target autonomously without human interaction at those critical functions of selecting and engaging the target. And that's the definition we propose. I'm not saying that's the only possible one or the one that have been adopted by states. None have been at that stage adopted by states. There are debates on that. And of course, human control is precisely the key issue that is being discussed. But beyond definition, I think what is important is to look at the various aspects through which human control can be ensured in the use of autonomous weapon systems, or including those that are that rely on artificial intelligence, if that's developed in the future. So it's as much as looking at ways to ensure human controls and ensuring that humans continue to deal with the obligation and to implement the obligation that are imposed upon parties to the conflict through international humanitarian law. That's, I think, one very important aspect. Just one word, if I may, on nuclear weapons to complete what Robin had said. There is no intention to look at nuclear weapons in and of themselves. That's not part of what we understand as the digitalization of conflicts. Now, the risk that the digitalization of conflicts might bring for nuclear weapons is by no means excluded from what we could envisage discussing, including whether you have autonomous systems or AI systems that are developed in terms of the security of nuclear weapons, or how much they are susceptible of being also tampered with through digital enabled tools, let's say. That's of course important in terms of the risk, because there is no more destructive weapons than a nuclear weapon. So that's of course key if we look at the potential risk. And as I mentioned, we have already seen, okay, that's not nuclear weapons, but nuclear electrical facility have been affected by cyber operations. I also know that Chatham House have done work and publication that are critical in the respect of the security of the cyber security of nuclear weapon systems by Patricia Lewis, notably. So that's certainly something that we will be conscious of going forward in the initiative, including, as we have said with Robin, engaging with experts across various fields and various institutions on that.
Great, thank you. I have another question about definitional issues from Elizabeth. It's about the notion of a digital battlefield. So Elizabeth is saying that apparently you seem to focus primarily on cyber warfare, lethal autonomous weapons, and artificial intelligence. But at the same time, she was wondering whether the discussion should also involve communication and battle management systems, including so-called combat clouds, aiming to increase situational awareness during combat operations. And she was also wondering whether the same holds true for swarm robotics.
If I may, just really briefly, an excellent question, but I think that's very much the long view to what we might be doing. So just to clarify, we're not looking into lethal autonomous weapon systems, because we think the past 7 or 8 years they've been sufficiently discussed. We know what many of the issues are. The challenges are more at the the political level, not so much in identifying the issues. We want to focus on AI in various military decision-making processes, and that's a very broad spectrum. And I think the way the process is going to unfold, how militaries will increasingly start to rely on AI, is first with regard to specific applications, with regard to information warfare, with regard to very specific decisions about whom to detain, which area to control, which weapons to use. But increasingly, and this is the midterm to long view, I think AI might replace existing command and control structures with new forms of decision making. And when we get to that level, but we're not quite there yet, I believe, then I think the issues that Elizabeth has raised will become more relevant to us. But initially, I don't think that's going to be our focus. Just while I have the floor, can I pick up on one other issue that Kirsten and Chelsea both mentioned, and also to tease Laurent a little bit, if I may. An issue which I'm not sure is going to be part of the initiative, but where I fully agree and which I've worked on quite a bit, is this erosion of the peace and war divide. And Chelsea and Kirsten have both said how very powerful power projections are facilitated through cyberspace. We're seeing a lot of that very disruptive, manipulative activity in peacetime. And you can leverage a lot of power through these manipulative operations. And I think that's increasingly a challenge for the military, that a lot of this disruptive activity is occurring in peacetime, actually. Some of it is battlefield preparation. I fully agree with Kirsten that the weapons notion doesn't make much sense in cyberspace. The arms race in cyberspace is more of a sabotage race, where you want to prepare the digital battlefield, get to know your enemy systems. But all of this is happening in peacetime, though it is related to military/armed conflict future activities. I don't think that's particularly a challenge for IHL, but it's a very big challenge for other areas of international law. How do we draw the lines with regard to that activity? It's a big topic. Maybe want to start a new and different initiative with UNIDIR, I don't know. I'll leave it to Laurent to say how much we're going into this. It's not primarily an IHL issue, but I fully agree this is a very big issue of very significant practical relevance.
Laurent, would you like to respond something on that?
I'm happy, but maybe Robin, you also had a question for Kirsten and Chelsea, I think, in what you said, and I think Kirsten, you wanted to have the floor just before, so I'm happy to just come afterwards if you prefer.
Perfect. Kirsten?
I wanted just to say something quickly about definitions. I mean, definitions have been very much at the heart from the very beginning of the information security discussion at the United Nations, and going all the way back to the first Russian-sponsored resolution in 1998, right? So this has been on the agenda for some time. And so the definition of whether we are talking about, for example, when we talk about ICTs and our national security, are we talking about content or not? That has been on the table now for 20 years. And that's not going to be, we're not making a lot of progress on it. There are fundamental divisions in that. And we see definitional issues on critical infrastructure, and the insistence that that's a national prerogative to define, identify and categorize critical infrastructure. So definitions are going to be tough. Autonomy is a characteristic, it's not a thing. It depends where it's applied, how it's applied, degree of autonomy, et cetera, et cetera. So again, coming up with definitions is going to be very tough, although working more closely with the technical community on that would help us. On the issue of human control, and I'll end it there on definitions of what meaningful and human and control or appropriate human judgment or whatever the term different communities like to use. I'd just like to draw your attention to some work that some of my colleagues at UNIDIR did earlier. I think really at the beginning of the year this year, on the human element in decisions about the use of force, and it has this very detailed graphic. We call it the iceberg graphics. It starts with an iceberg. And when we talk about, human control of the critical functions, that is literally the tip of the iceberg. And when rather than saying we need to have a definition about what meaningful human control is or what human control means, take a look at this iceberg and ask yourself at every step, there must be, I don't know, 25, 30 steps. And it details where the human element comes in everywhere from the political level to the strategic level to the operational level to the tactical level and planning and tactical level in the mission. There's a human element everywhere. And the question is, as we're using digital technologies at each one of those human-centric steps, are we doing enough to comply with our legal obligations or our norms, et cetera, et cetera? So it's not just like a one shot, check the box, is there human control or not human control? It's at every step in the process. Are we aware of the risks? Have we done everything to exercise the appropriate level of control?
Great, thank you very much. I have a question from Can that is also related to the peace-armed conflict divide. It's a quite long question, so I will try to paraphrase or to focus on the most salient aspects. The most salient aspect regards the Geneva Conventions and the IHL treaties. And so looking at the fact that actually, when we talk about the digitalization of armed conflict, at the end of the day, it might not be only about armed conflict. Is it just sufficient to say that IHL applies to these situations, or should we have a broader approach? And actually, does this debate challenge the traditional approach to warfare and the traditional approach adopted by the Geneva Conventions? So for instance, the last part of the question is it most likely to achieve a consequence? I mean, I guess the consequence in terms of humanitarian protection with applying such rules, so the Geneva Conventions, APs, to cyber operations as commonly done, while evaluating the topic with regard to use ad bellum or a digital Geneva Convention as suggested by Microsoft. So here the question is a digital Geneva Convention needed, basically? And should the approach be completely revised and not simply looking at IHL and how it applies to armed conflicts in which new technologies will be used? A tricky question.
Not sure. I think I have a straightforward answer to it. So I think the answer is no. I don't think we're looking into the fifth Geneva Convention here. I don't think that's needed, nor would it be timely to do so. I think we might be looking at supplementing some of the rules, clarification, specification, supplementation in specific select areas if needed. We're not quite there yet, but that's our approach. I don't think either of us has a fifth Geneva Convention in mind. I quite liked Microsoft's initiative at the time, the idea of a digital Geneva Convention, but that was mostly focused on malicious cyber activity in peacetime, I believe. Still, I think we can handle much of this with existing paradigms that just need some reconceptualization, fine-tuning and sharpening, maybe. And I do think that Microsoft's initiative sparked debate and helped to generate momentum about fresh thinking regarding some of these issues. And that's certainly something that we'll try to do in the initiative. But at the end of the day, there is no need to do it all over again or to reinvent the wheel. That's not required as far as I can see by the risks and protection needs as they currently unfold.
Other panelists want to add something on that?
Yes, if I may, just one point on, because it raised question of use ad bellum, and I think another question raised similar issue between the link between use ad bellum and international humanitarian law with regard to the notion of attack. And I think it's important to, when we discuss armed conflicts, including when we, and to come back to the question of that Robin put to me earlier, when you said you would tease me on that, and how to look at aspects that are not directly armed conflict. There are cyber operations raise a lot of questions with many thresholds, and it's important to make clear of what threshold we are talking when we are talking of armed conflict or of attacks, because the question, I mean, the challenges that cyber operations raise are similar in the sense of which cyber operations cross which threshold, but we can't answer them globally because those thresholds are different. They are defined by different bodies of law. So for instance, an attack in international humanitarian law, it has nothing to do, I mean, it's a different notion than an armed attack under Article 51 of the UN Charter and ad bellum. And it may very well be that attacks as understood under international humanitarian law are at much lower threshold. So many more cyber operations might fulfill the definition of attack when they are carried out in an armed conflict, even if they would not be armed attack in the sense of Article 51 of the Charter. That's really two different notions. And similarly, for the question of whether that's an armed conflict or not, what are you actually looking at? Are you looking at whether that's an armed attack under the UN Charter, which enables the right to self-defense, or whether are you looking at whether that's an armed conflict as defined in Common Article 2 to the Geneva Conventions, which is another body of law, so international humanitarian law. And that's really different. Now, with regards to Robin's point on and one of the question on preparation of the battlefield, militaries are preparing the battlefield all the time in peacetime, of course, and they do want to know where their vulnerabilities of the enemy are, whether it's in cyberspace or in any other domain. So that's in a way, some aspect of it at least are not new in cyberspace. And I think in those debates in cyberspace, it's important to clarify what is actually really new because it's cyber, or what is actually not so new. Maybe it was raising questions already before, maybe had already disagreement before and different positions between states beforehand, which are pre-existing and will continue, of course, to exist when it comes to cyberspace. Now, so getting intelligence information about the enemy and their vulnerability, that's nothing new. It's just a new mean, but it doesn't raise new question. Now, implanting malware or cyber logic bombs in enemy targets or enemy potential targets of potential enemies, that's of course something different than collecting intelligence information. So does it raise new question? Is it the same as sabotage? You mentioned, Robin, putting pre-implanting mines in another territory of somebody who is against whom you are not yet in a conflict, and what does it mean? That raises indeed very interesting question for IHL, but more importantly for other bodies of law. That's made more complicated in cyberspace, I think, by all the question of attribution and anonymity, because that might also have an impact both in terms of what it means legally speaking, because if it's done by a state or if it's done by a private individual not under the instruction of a state, that might raise a different question with regard to different bodies of law. Justin, you mentioned before the question of cyber crimes versus other bodies of law. That's also important to have in mind when we look at this field generally. Now, I'm not saying that we will look at all of that in the initiative, of course. It's not part of at least our mandate at the ICRC to look at international youth ad bellum or the Charter. And cybercrime is also not something we have expertise to look at, so I don't think we would look at that. Now, a question of clarifying the threshold, and with that, I mentioned earlier, gray zone, helping to try to make the gray zone less gray, or to reduce what is the gray zone by clarifying some elements of those various thresholds, where they lie, where it's clear here or there, or at least the boundaries, reduce the boundaries of the gray zone by clarifying for example, when international humanitarian law applies, is certainly something that we are very interested in working on, whether that's as part of the initiative or more generally, that's of course linked to the application of IHL to cyber operations more generally.
All right, thank you. I think that there is a question that is directly connected to what you are saying, a question from Altea regarding the definition of attack under IHL. She says, as Ms. Vigna highlighted, most of operations employing the technologies at hand would not reach the threshold of attack under IHL. When it comes to such operations, do you see the possibility for the development of a different and specific interpretation of the notion of attack, which would be characterized by a lower threshold? So basically, should we lower the threshold of attack in order to be able to apply IHL to these situations? Or is the solution elsewhere? Kirstine, I don't know if you want to take that one.
As there are lawyers and legal people here, I think I'll leave it to them.
All right.
Oh, happy to step in.
So okay, go ahead, Robin.
On this one, I think that really brings us back to what Althea is doing. She's raising a very relevant technical question. Where do we situate that threshold of the attack notion? But she's in her question also making very clear that what we're really discussing is at which level of impact and severity do we want protective principles under IHL to kick in and to unfold their legal relevance? And I think that's the issue that we need to discuss in the first instance. Mindful of the fact that IHL only ever attempts to regulate and provide baseline protection, not perfect protection. If it did that, wars could not be fought, and the legal regime would become rather irrelevant, I'm afraid. So what we need to have is, I think, not so much a legal discussion on how we could interpret this threshold of the attack notion. It's more of a policy discussion informed by, as Kirsten was saying earlier, technologists, scientists. What kind of impact is it that should really concern us? What is it that states, maybe military actors, have in mind? That information admittedly is difficult to come by, but I think as operations unfold, as these discussions unfold, we're getting a better idea and a clearer picture of what that might be. And I don't know where exactly to draw that line. And as I said, that should be a multi-stakeholder approach to negotiate that line. But I think we need that step back to start that negotiation. What do we think is acceptable in terms of civilian or societal impact in the 21st century? Cutting all citizens of Geneva off from Facebook, is that something that should come within the protective ambit of IHL? Is that baseline protection in times of war? I'm not so sure. Cutting everyone's electricity off, causing a blackout by cyber means, with no physical destruction, it's just the loss of this functionality. I think that's maybe a different level. And somewhere there, we need to have that discussion and tease out the red lines that we think should be drawn in the 21st century. And I think the problem that we're having right now is that much of the thinking that has gone into these rules that we're working with, the attack threshold, they're very 20th century, they're kinetic, it's the industrial world of the 20th century. And nowadays, with all the economic, financial, and other very diverse and diffuse effects that cyber operations can have, we might have to renegotiate these baseline protections. So I don't have the exact answer to Althea's question, but it's certainly something that we want to look at, and it's at the heart of the matter of providing adequate protection in modern digitalized armed conflict.
Thank you very much.
Just if I may add on that, because I think that's a very important debate, but I would like to make a couple of points on that. The debate on attack is very important, but we should not look at only the question of attack when we look at the protection afforded by international humanitarian law. There are a number of rules that protect more broadly than the rules that apply only on attack. And that's the case for a lot of critical infrastructure. For example, the medical care must be respected and protected, and that's way broader than only the prohibition to attack them. Goods indispensable to the survival of the population, it's prohibited to attack them, but it's also prohibited to render them useless, whichever way you render them useless. So that's very much an effect-based approach in that regard. So yes, the debate on attack is important, but we should be careful of not looking at everything through that debate. There are plenty of also protection in international humanitarian law that go beyond, and especially for what we called precisely especially protected objects, which are the most important one, and why and that's the reason why they have an enhanced stronger protection than other civilian objects through those broader and more stronger specific protections. Now, just to Althea's questions and Robin's answer on that make me fear a little bit that the debate is framed as if the old view is that the result is only physical, and the question is whether we need to lower that for cyber operations. I would rather put it differently in saying that the question of how attack is interpreted for cyberspace is for the time being not clear. And it's not whether we need to lower it compared to a previous example. Let me give you a very practical example, attacks against electricity network. And of course, it might be done through bombs, but it might also be done through fiber carbon bombs, which, as I'm sure some of you know, have been developed to create short circuits in electric systems in order to cause less impact. So actually, they don't cause physical damage, they just cause short circuits, which cut the electricity. And nobody have had any question that the use of those bombs were regulated by the notion of attack. Dropping such a bomb on an electricity grid is prohibited unless this electricity grid is a military objective. But it's prohibited to do that against a civilian electricity grid because that's an attack, despite the fact that it only creates shortcuts. And there, you look only at the effect. So the question is whether, when you look at cyber operations, a cyber operation that have the same effect as a graphite bomb, so just shutting down the electricity temporarily or in a manner that makes it less damaging than physical damage, is also an attack, meaning it's also prohibited to do that against an electricity network that is at that moment a civilian and not a military objective. So I think we need to be careful in how the debate is framed as well, and whether it's about lowering the threshold. I don't think that's the case. It's about being clearer on where the threshold lines, and in that sense, being clearer on what already limits the rules on attack imposed with regard to cyber operations.
Thank you very much. I have a broader question that I find interesting here from Kiaha, which is the following. How does the digitalization of conflict change the roles of security sectors, i.e. the roles of military, police, intelligence? Does it bring non-military actors, not limited to security sector, into the IHL sphere? Chelsea or Kirsten, what do you think about that?
I'll leave the IHL sphere for our lawyer colleagues on the panel, yeah. But I think, as we both said before, I mean, given the nature of this space, it is different than the other areas, and so there is a lot of the more civilian elements that come into play, and you know, given that it's often the private sector, there's the innovators, the operators, the creators of this space, and fundamentally too, then how you respond to these types of threats and challenges, you know, not necessarily always from a military perspective, but more law enforcement, or more through education and training, or public awareness, the basic hygiene, as we've discussed. So I think, yes, it absolutely kind of expands the notion of how we effectively respond, which is why it's important to develop policies and national strategies that really encapsulate all these different elements and bring them together. I would also add, and this perhaps goes back to the discussion between the different spaces, if you like, the peacetime and conflict. But you know, the notion that a lot of these things, especially when I'm thinking about political decision making, you know, you have the frameworks that you work within, of course, but then what you also really need to do is look at, on a case-by-case basis, what are we facing, what is the situation at hand, and then to have a look at the toolbox and say, okay, is it more through economic aspects, or more through political aspects, or law enforcement, or no, we're looking more diplomatic, or at the military option, then, you know, escalating up. So it's once again about of course, having the frameworks in place, absolutely, but then, you know, when you're kind of facing something, then to look at it and say, okay, what is the situation in its totality? What tools are available in our toolbox across the different spectrum? And then how can we most appropriately employ those in order to defend or respond or deter? So having, in addition to that, different actors coming into it, of course, this broader holistic perspective as to how do we best employ the tools that we have at our disposal in a way, of course, that's in accordance with international law, but also that really tries to target the issue that we're facing and employ the right response to it.
Excellent, thank you. Someone else wants to complement on the IHL side?
No, just briefly, and I'm mindful of the time. I think, that's another distinction is going to be challenged on different levels by cyberspace. And I think part of that is the dual use nature of much of the cyber infrastructure. But another challenging issue is the plurality of actors involved. The intersection with the private sector industry that Chelsea was mentioning. I think much of the infrastructure is run or provided by the industrial sector. Much of the much of the technology is being developed by private actors, and they're clearly taking the lead there. So this plurality of different actors, public, private, military, civilian, is, I think, in cyberspace, and add AI to it, going to be of increasing relevance, and certainly can pose a challenge to the principle of distinction in future conflicts.
Okay, great. Thank you. I take a very last question because it's from one of our TAs. And so I wouldn't like not to take his question. So his question is for Professor Geiss, for Robin. He said that you explain in your course that in order to be able to carry out effective cyber attacks in an armed conflict, the base for being able to do so needs to be laid well in advance. These activities of breaking into potential adversary systems, detecting vulnerabilities, implanting code, etc., would be, or rather are already carried out before the start of an armed conflict. I know that Laurent Giselle already mentioned the so-called gray zone, but I would be particularly interested in hearing whether the research project will also consider the legal framework that would apply to these types of operations, and if so, where you would see the main challenges.
So yeah, I mean, that goes back, it's an excellent question. And it goes back to the issue of battlefield preparation, really, which I think Laurent already said we're not planning to target and address as such. It's not part of the ICRC's mandate to look into what really is a use ad bellum issue. But let me just say this from as an objective observer of these debates. I think what we're seeing there is increasingly an attempt to draw up lines of protection under use ad bellum. So we're transposing IHL rationale of protecting certain sectors, protecting certain things. You can really see it in the Oxford statement on protecting the health sector, the medical sector. That really is an IHL rationale, but we're now discussing it under the use ad bellum, the peacetime legal regime, because this is where the malicious cyber activity is happening. And this is where states increasingly, for the sake of stability, want to draw certain legal lines. So we're in a process of reconfiguring certain use ad bellum thresholds, if you want. And you can do this with the principle of sovereignty, the non-intervention principle, or the prohibition on the use of force in more extreme cases. We have all these different thresholds, and what we're currently kind of doing is trying to apply a new logic whereby we can draw clearer red lines with regard to the malicious cyber activity that we're seeing. And to some degree, and especially with this Oxford statement on protecting the medical sector, that very much reminded me of classical IHL thinking. This is important. This is something we need to protect from certain detrimental impact. And we're introducing that thinking now into the realm of use ad bellum. And why? Because the divide of peace and war is to a certain degree eroding.
All right, thank you very much for this very rich discussion. I thank you also our audience. I thank also our audience for the very precise and high-level questions we received. So we all look forward to see the continuation of this project and to look at the output. So thank you so much for all your investment, And I look forward to seeing you in the near future. Take care and stay well.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thanks,
Stay
everyone.
safe.
Have a good
Bye-bye.
day.